Welcome to What Becomes a Classic, the show that takes a closer look at those children's books that are just so good that they never get old. I'm Leonard Marcus, and I am here today at the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture to talk about a very special book of poems for young readers, The Dream Keeper by Langston Hughes, which was first published in 1932. With me to tell us more about this beautiful book and its author is Alexandra Mitchell, who is a reference librarian and archivist here at the Schomburg. Hello, Alexandra.
Hi, Leonard.
Thank you for having us here.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Langston Hughes, tell us a little bit about who he was.
Langston Hughes is most widely known for his poetry, his work during the Harlem Renaissance, which we're here in Harlem, so it's a very special place to Langston Hughes. He was also a playwright and wrote a number of novels as well. Just a really pioneering writer, mostly known for the Harlem Renaissance period and beyond.
So he was born in 1902 and in Joplin, Missouri, and he traveled around an awful lot as a child, didn't he?
He did. So he's born in Joplin, then ended up moving to Lawrence, Kansas. He moved to a number of Midwestern cities, but really spent the majority of his time in Lawrence. And so during his time there, he ended up, his parents divorced, and he ended up being raised primarily by his grandmother. And so during his time with his grandmother in primary school, he was elected to be the class poet, which kind of spawned and sparked his interest in poetry and in writing, and that continued throughout his younger education days. He wrote for the newspaper and also a number of different publications.
It feels like writing for him was almost a lifeline, wasn't it?
It was, in a way. During the time that he was separated from his parents, he really felt lonely a lot of times in his childhood, and so he turned to books. He turns to books, he turns to writing as a means to feel connected and as a refuge really for him during a tough phase in his adolescent years.
And as a child, and really through most of his life, he faced a certain amount of prejudice, didn't he? For being African American. And one of the big messages of his poetry is having pride in your heritage, isn't it?
It is, absolutely. He's, of course, a pioneer as a poet, but as a black poet and as a black writer, really instilling this sense of self. No matter where he is, he traveled largely throughout the entire African diaspora at a time when most African Americans weren't really traveling at all. And this really speaks to his diasporic roots in Mexico and Cuba with his father and different traveling. And this really enriched his writing and his writing about black people and heritage and black culture, and instilling a sense of pride in a number of his children's books, as well as his regular writings for adults.
It's really interesting to me that the very first poems that he published were in a magazine for children, the Brownies Book, in 1921. Yeah,
so the Brownies Book was an offshoot of the Crisis magazine, which was started by the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, largely pioneered by major black history figures such as W.E.B. Du Bois. And so the Crisis decided to start the Brownies Book. It ran for a little under 2 years, and it was like their children section of the regular Crisis magazine. And so he published his first poems, as you mentioned, in the Brownies books, which we have here at the Schomburg Center.
Tell us a little bit more about what was happening in Harlem. What made it such an exciting place to be when Langston Hughes was living here?
So Langston Hughes lived here at two or more different points of his life. When it was time for him to go to college, he begged his father to help him enroll at Columbia University, which is here in Harlem. And he did so under the guise that he would study engineering, which didn't really pan out in the long term for him. But it got him the opportunity to live in Harlem. He really took to the community more so than he did to the university. He loved the art scene. You know, the Cotton Club is happening during this time.
Some of the poems in The Dream Keeper are blues lyrics, aren't they? So he was very interested in the music that was going on around here. He
was very interested in the music and in rhythms. He wrote a number of more musically inclined poems, but also like more musical, just more pure music as opposed to like a poetry form. He was like chastised very early on for his rhythmic poetry, which I assume wasn't really popular when he was growing up, and he was, I guess, a pioneer in that way. But I'm sure that was just a bit of osmosis and him being here in Harlem and in street scenes. And you see a lot of writers who live in urban cities talk about the way that just listening to the day-to-day beat and life of people just really inspired their writing. And so he was a primary figure for that example.
One of the things that I love about his poems is that they're so simple in a way, and yet they're so packed with feeling.
Absolutely. They're packed with a number of different emotions, and what I take away from reading even just, the shortest of poems written by Langston Hughes is that he captures the most emotion in his choice of words and scenery and language that really gets to the breadth in describing something that is just, you can see it just from reading the words. You get to paint the setting.
In some of his poems, it's almost like he's a photographer wandering in the streets, and he'll notice somebody, like an old woman, just sitting by herself, and in a very few words, he'll imagine a whole past for her.
Absolutely, and that's the beauty of creative writing.
And then he also will describe nature, the beauty of nature, the way poets have for centuries. But he'll talk about the raindrops falling in the gutters of the street. So he's bringing it back to the life of the people around him. Absolutely,
really tying in that Harlem street scene. He was friends with a number of famous photographers, which may have been another creative end to his ability to capture this poetic vision, not just with words, but with, like you're saying, recreating a vision. So he was friends with people like Carl Van Vechten, who of course photographed all the major Harlem Renaissance poets and writers and pioneers, and so that may have added a bit of his ability to write for a vision.
And I think if you were to say what his favorite word was of all the words that he used, it would probably be dream.
I agree.
Wouldn't it?
I agree. For me, when I look at the dream keeper, I think of somebody like Langston Hughes, a young person or younger Langston. Anybody who has a dream and an idea that, they go through hardships in life, he faced a number of hardships, but just really maintaining that inner strength and fortitude and the ability to carry your dreams with you through difficult times. And so any young person who has a dream and an idea, something they want to be or want to become, I think of that person when I think of Langston's idea of the dreamer and the dream keeper.
It's a simple message, but a very powerful one.
Absolutely,
isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. Yeah, he seemed to have a very close connection to libraries in general, and to this library in particular.
Absolutely. So he, as a reader growing up and as a young writer, he spent a lot of time in libraries, but when he came to Harlem, built a number of really important friendships, and one of those important friendships was with Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, Afro-Latino bibliophile, scholar, and collector of materials related to the African diaspora, and again, our namesake here. And so, as I mentioned, he would collect materials, but also do readings here and spent a lot of time in the library just as a user and made friends with the librarians here. They became his friends and peers, and would just always, anytime he could, would donate things to the Schomburg Center for our readers. And his ashes are actually interned in the middle of the Cosmogram in our Langston Hughes lobby, which is named after him, in a book-like urn, which we left for Schomburg.
Tell us what a cosmogram is.
A cosmogram is it's a circle, and I hope you get to see it. But it's originally from the Kikongo tradition, and the cosmogram is really a symbol of life and death and rebirth. It's the continuum of the life process. So there's an idea. The idea is that life doesn't end with death, but it spawns a rebirth. And so the cosmogram that we have here was done by Houston Conwell, fantastic artist that passed away a couple of years ago, and it symbolizes the many rivers, and rivers is another word that I would say Langston uses a lot and thinks about a lot. But the many rivers that Langston Hughes traversed throughout his life, and then also many of the cities that were important to his life. And so you see the birth line, you see where he's born in Joplin, Mississippi, you see him traveling through Cuba or through Mexico or through other parts of the diaspora, and then you see it ultimately ending with him here in Harlem, but then that idea that the life cycle continues on. And so that's the idea of the cosmogram, the main four circles that are part of the circle of life.
I see. And when I introduced you, I mentioned that you are an archivist as well as a librarian. Tell us what an archivist does.
An archivist does many exciting things, but mainly an archivist pretty much preserves and organizes materials for researchers to come in and find materials about any given subject, person, or a specific type of writing, any specific subject. So I organize them and make them in the best structure for you to come in and look at them for the next 100 years.
Okay, so it sounds like if someone wanted to know more about Langston Hughes, this would be a very good place for them to come.
This is a fantastic place for them to come. We have some of his papers here. Because he lived such a diasporic life, many of his papers are found throughout the diaspora and in different libraries here in the U.S. But because he was such a son of Harlem and a friend of the Schomburg Center, we have letters from him and Arturo Alfonso Schomburg to each other throughout their travels and throughout their lives. Handwritten plays, different manuscript, type poems, photographs, and all kind of different materials that really speak to his really rich and special life.
Very cool. Well, Alexandra, thank you very much.
You're very welcome, Leonard. Thank you.